Have you ever seen a headline like, U.S. imposes new sanctions on Iran, or Western sanctions aim to cripple Russia? What even are sanctions? Is it like blocking someone on Instagram, but for countries? We hear about sanctions. They're often used in hopes of pressuring a country into change. But here's the weird part. Some countries have been under sanctions and they're still standing. So it makes you ask, what exactly are sanctions? Why do countries use them? Do they actually work? Why do so many people say sanctions fail? And what can we actually do about it? We'll break down everything you need to know about sanctions. But before we continue, a quick shout out to this video's sponsor, VPN. So we've been talking about how countries can be sanctioned, blocked from trading, or using global systems. People get digitally sanctioned too? Ever tried to access Netflix and it shows different content or even not region? Then how to get around this? Well, with Surfshark VPN, you can switch your virtual location to over 100 countries. With just one click, you can unlock content that was blocked before. Not only that, it also keeps your data safe, and especially on public Wi-Fi, or if you just don't want to be tracked. And the best part is it's one of the cheapest VPNs out there. Use it on unlimited devices with just one account. So cheap. So try it risk-free for 30 days. And don't forget Explains 101 to get 4 extra months for free. Just click the link in the description, and yep, there's a full money tea. Now, let's get back to the video. Section 1. What are sanctions? Simply put, sanctions stop or limit a country, a group, or even a person from doing business or interacting with the one giving the sanctions. For example, if your country gets sanctioned by both the US and the UK, then your country cannot trade or do business with the US. And if your country gets sanctioned by the whole world, your country gets kicked out of the world's group chat. So who can get sanctioned? Anyone can get sanctioned. Sometimes sanctions are aimed at an entire country. In other cases, the target is more specific, companies or industries, usually military weapon related, or some groups like terrorist groups, military groups, or team. It could also be individuals like a country's leader, military generals, or wealthy elites. The sanctions international bank accounts, seize their overseas properties, or ban them from traveling. Then what types of sanctions? There are different types of sanctions, and it isn't always about money. First, there are diplomatic sanctions, where countries use ties. Like in 2021, China got mad at Lithuania for allowing Taiwan to open an office using the name instead of Taipei like usual. So China downgraded its embassy and stopped issuing visas to Lithuanians. There are military sanctions, which means stopping weapons and military help. Like the UN banned countries from sending or selling Korea, hoping it would slow down their nuclear program. This is also called an arms embargo. Third, there are which means banning a country from sporting events. Like after Russia invaded Ukraine, many global sports bodies banned from competitions, including FIFA and the Olympics. In some sports, Russian athletes are only allowed to compete as nude without their flag or anthem. The fourth is economic sanctions. These are the most powerful because they involve economic sanctions can include embargoes. An embargo means banning or limiting trade with the sanctioned country. The most well-known types is the arms embargo, as we mentioned earlier. It can also freeze offshore accounts, so the sanctioned country has their offshore money, and restrict companies from doing business with the sanctioned country. Take the Russia-Ukraine war as after the invasion of Ukraine, Russia was hit with a wave of economic sanctions by the West. This led to major Western companies. Visa and MasterCard stopped working for international payments. Apple stopped selling products and limited some services, shut down. Netflix stopped streaming, and the ruble's value dropped almost overnight. So now you understand. Your next question is, why do countries use them? Well, let's talk about it in the next section. Section 2. Why sanctions in the first place? Well, the main reason is to put pressure, hoping the sanctioned country or entity would change. Sanctioned countries are usually sanctioned due to issues like invading another country, violating human rights, building or interfering in another nation's internal affairs. In the past, if this kind of thing happened, usually another war and fight. But in this modern era, it's not that easy anymore. Especially if the other side has nuclear weapons, going to war with them would be World War III. So what to do? Well, putting sanctions. Why? When doing nothing might seem weak and starting a war is too dangerous, then sanctions are often seen as a middle ground. Sanctions like economic sanctions, hoping that the sanctioned country's economy gets hurt enough, gets isolated, which will finally make them give up, all without sacrificing thousands of lives. But of course, sanctions aren't all rights or global peace. Sometimes a country might get sanctioned just because it's seen as a rival or even just pure politics. Example, Cuba has been under U.S. sanctions since 1962 due to the Cuban Missile Crisis during the Cold War until 2025, long after the Cold War has ended. Meanwhile, the U.S. has normalized trade with other communist and even Vietnam. Yeah, if you still remember the Vietnam War. But Cuba still got a heavy embargo, even though it doesn't have missiles anymore, is much smaller, and has no real threat to the U.S. So why? Well, some are due to politics, like its proximity to the U.S., and domestic election politics, which are too complicated to be explained in this video. Then there's something that people get wrong about sanctions. It's not only the United States, European Union, and the United Nations that can. Actually, any country can use sanctions. As I mentioned before, China has imposed sanctions on Lithuania over. Even a smaller country like Singapore has imposed sanctions on Russia due to the Ukraine war. Now that we know what and why countries use them, the big question is, do they actually work? Well, we'll talk about that in the next section. Section 3. Do sanctions actually work? The answer is sometimes yes, but a lot of the time, not really. Success was during apartheid in South Africa. Short history. At that time, the majority black population was ruled by a white minority imposed strict racial discrimination. Lots of countries across the world cut trade, pulled diplomats, and even banned their sports national competitions. Over time, the apartheid government eventually gave in to pressure and ended the system. But are rare. More often, sanctions don't lead to big changes. North Korea's system is still the same after decades of sanctions. Now, they've started firing missiles. Russia kept fighting after being hit with tons of sanctions. Myanmar's juntas. So why is that? Why do some sanctions seem to work, while others seem to have no effect at all? Well, that's what next. Section 4. Why sanctions often fail. If sanctions are supposed to put heavy pressure on governments, they fail so often. Well, the first reason is because sanctions usually hurt people more than elites. On paper, like wealthy elites are getting punished, losing their yachts, having their bank accounts frozen, and others. But in reality, it's you people who suffer the most. When a country gets sanctioned with something like a trade embargo, they cannot export or import trees. This leads to fewer goods, less income, and a broken supply chain. Prices start to rise. Business even shut down. People lose jobs, and everyday life turns into a daily struggle. In Myanmar, for example, sanctioned job losses in the garment industry. In North Korea, decades of sanctions have crushed the economy for common people, yet still live comfortably. Also, leaders and elites often find loopholes to get around the sanctions. It's not hard for elites to have secret offshore accounts, private supply chains, close ties with other unsanctioned countries, or help them keep operating. Sometimes, sanctions hurt regular people the most, while elites stay in control like nothing happened. The second reason is sanctions often misunderstand how people respond. Sometimes, putting pressure on average people is part of the, sounds cruel, but the idea is, if enough people are suffering, they might start protesting against their leaders and demand change. But again, this often fails or even backfires in tight authoritarian countries where media is tightly controlled. Leaders can use these sanctions as propaganda, saying, "We're under attack from foreign enemies, support me for our homeland." And they support from the brainwashed and fearful people. So, complicated, huh? Then, the third reason is sanctions more resistant and push them to become more independent. Yeah, this is a plot twist. For example, after the 20th annexation, Russia got sanctioned heavily by the from that experience, Russia spent years reducing its West. They built alternative banking systems, stockpiled reserves, and started trading more with countries like China. And so when the bigger sanctions came in 2022, they were more ready than people expected. Another example is China, which is building self-reliance despite not being under heavy sanctions. It even launched its own space station after being banned from space station by the United States. The more a country adapts like this, the harder it becomes to isolate them again. Is accidentally damaging the one who is giving the sanctions. Another plot twist. For example, after Europe banned its airspace, Russia responded by banning European airlines from flying over its vast territory. This forced Europe to take longer routes, causing delays and higher fuel costs. The fifth reason is loopholes. For example, put sanctions on Russia, it said no more European products can enter Russia. But the problem is how to ensure or it won't happen. Europe can still sell products to another country, and then they're smuggled into Russia, like to a dealer in Georgia, relabeled there and then sent into Russia. Even though Georgia has banned the re-export, the loop is hard to close. So without strict monitoring, sanctions become more of a suggestion than a serious barrier. So endings tend to fail when they hurt the wrong people, are easy to get around, strengthen the enemy's propaganda. Now we dive. How sanctions can actually work. Sanctions don't always work, but that doesn't mean they're useless. Many experts agree can still be effective, but only if they're designed and applied the right way. The first key is sanctions must be well-targeted. Sanctions that punish an entire population usually backfire and make life harder for regular people, while the leader and elites stayed. That's why more targeted sanctions focus more on freezing elites' personal bank accounts, seizing luxury and banning them from traveling. Because when the people in power don't feel the pain, they won't feel the pressure to change. Sanctions must be well enforced. The main reason sanctions fail is because if just one country puts sanctions, just finds someone else to trade with. But if the whole world works together, then the sanctioned country would find it harder to locate. Good enforcement includes a good monitoring system, international cooperation, and severe penalties for violations. This is super difficult as every country has its own interests and agenda. The third key is clear risk and reward. Real progress, ease the sanctions. If things get worse, tighten them. That way, countries have a reason to cooperate. If good behavior is never rewarded, why would anyone bother to change? When sanctions are smart, focused, and backed by mass, they stand a much better chance of working. So, in conclusion, sanctions are meant to pressure countries or entities to change more. They've succeeded, like helping end the apartheid regime in South Africa. But sanctions are also not perfect, as they will change in places like North Korea. If the goal is to send a strong message, they usually work. But if the goal is to force major political change, sanctions alone usually aren't enough. So next time you hear about sanctions, remember, always the powerful solution they seem. If you want me to make other videos explaining these topics, please like and subscribe for watching.